Hi everyone, how many of you have been in a situation in which you pick up a paper to read and you find out that you spend a whole day just trying to figure out what the paper is all about, only to find out that this paper is not relevant to what you want to achieve? I've been in such situations many times before, and it took me years of trial and error to adopt a methodology that allowed me to actually go through papers very quickly in order to understand what the paper is all about without reading the whole piece. I never read a paper from beginning to end, and I read only what is relevant and only what I need. In today's video, I'm going to show you why you should never read a paper from end to end and what my method is. So let's get my computer, we're gonna go straight in and I'm gonna show you what exactly I do when I read a paper. I'm going to pick one of my papers to go through, just to avoid any copyright issues. But the paper can be any. The paper can be of any topic, any style, any journal, or even it can be a non-academic paper that follows the same standards when it comes to structure and presentations of idea. So let's turn on that computer and find the paper. The very first thing we would be looking at the paper is the title. The title can be any title, but titles are always important because they contain some keywords. The author of the paper always thinks very carefully what the title would be, because a title that has keywords makes the paper easily found online or in the databases of journal publications. So authors, it's of their interest to make their papers as easily found as possible. That's why they pick keywords, and these keywords can generate specific search volume. It's almost like you Googling something. You're thinking about the keywords, and the article or the page that has those keywords would be among the first ones to come in the search results section. So the very first thing when you consider what types of articles you would find would be to consider the keywords that you would like to search for. And obviously, if the paper has the same keywords as the ones that you're interested, the topics or the themes that you're interested in the work, then it's a good match. So it's already a good start. Nevertheless, only looking at the title can be confusing, and actually it can make us to make some mistake. Because, as I said, titles are important and authors want to find as many readers as possible, so they may actually tweak some of the wording. They may actually present their paper in front of the wrong audience, but not by mistake. It's just because they would like to sell their ideas to a bigger audience. That's why we should never select a paper to read based on the title alone. Although it's a first step, we should pay attention to the abstract. And the abstract has two very important parts, which is the first two sentences. And the first two sentences share the context of this study or this part of this research. So read the first two sentences. If it's a completely different context that you're not interested in, just scrap the paper. But before that, it may be a good idea to pay attention to the last one sentence of the abstract. It typically shares what the major contribution of this paper is. So when I read the paper, I start off with the title, I look at the first two sentences of the abstract and perhaps the last sentence. And if these are good, if these are relevant to my needs, and I then pay attention to the keywords. Every paper, published paper, has some keywords, which again is a way for the search engines to index this paper. So pay attention to these as well. And typically, as I follow these three steps, I find out that 80% of the articles I come across are not relevant, and I just stop reading it. I don't waste my time. I completely delete them. So you should do the same. The next big section to go through very quickly, of course, is the introduction section. Many people spend a lot of time reading every single word of the introduction section, but this should not be the case. What I typically do is I read the first paragraph of the introduction. The first paragraph is where authors would typically explain the broader context or describe what the current problem is, and they would like to kind of address this problem, or at least their work would provide some sort of a solution to this problem. So the context is important because if the context, again, is completely different from what you are trying to study as a context, then you can just stop reading from this moment. Unless you want to borrow some other parts, such as let's say, parts of the literature, parts of the theoretical framework, etc. But we're going to cover these in a second. And in addition to the first paragraph of the introduction, I suggest that you read the last paragraph as well, but not the one that shares that the next section would be literature review, methodology, etc. If this is the last paragraph, you don't read this one, you read the one before the last. This is where you'd find that the author has shared the major contribution of the paper, or has implied at least the findings of the paper. And then you can quickly understand whether this article could be used as a support to something that you're saying in your own work or not. And if not, just leave it there. There are many points in which you may decide to leave a paper. Don't consider that this has been a waste of time. Actually, you're saving time. It's natural that you go through many different pieces of work before you find the ones that are relevant. And don't hope to continue reading only to find something that's relevant. It almost never happens. So your best idea is to just stop reading at this moment. If your reading so far ticks all boxes or all checkpoints, which means the title is relevant, the abstract is relevant, the keywords are there and they are relevant, the context introduced in the introduction section is relevant, and the findings introduced in the introduction section are relevant, then you may as well continue reading. The next section that comes is the literature review. If all of these beforehand have been sufficed for, then you can expect the literature review to be highly relevant to your needs. However, that does not mean that you should read the whole literature review. Literature reviews are the longest sections within any paper. Therefore, you want to save as much time from the literature review section as possible. And in order to do so, you would identify exactly the strands of literature that are relevant to you. So how do you find that? Well, typically, given that the literature review section is very long, authors have subsections, and the titles of those subsections are very important. Pay attention to the titles and pick only the ones that you feel are relevant. Then you can borrow them and introduce them to your own work in your own words. In order to have a helicopter view of what streams of literature are discussed, read the first 2 paragraphs of the literature review. Typically, they would present all different pieces of literature that have been mentioned in the literature review and explain how these are pieced together. And it's perfectly fine to take only some of the pieces rather than all of the pieces. As a matter of fact, I strongly encourage you to take only the pieces that are relevant. Otherwise, you may risk just stealing other people's literature review, which is never a good idea. I'm scrolling down the paper only to find out that the next section is the methodology section. This is a section that all papers must have, and there you would explain the sort of particularities when it comes to data collection, when it comes to sampling, when it comes to justifying the choices you've made in terms of the empirical work and the analysis of your dissertation or your research project. The methodology section is a section that is almost universal. If you're using qualitative methodology, for example, that utilizes interview data, then you can expect more or less that all of the authors that are using these sort of methods would have roughly the same type of methodology or roughly the same type of analytical framework. And the structure of the methodology is very straightforward. You would be justifying the methods. You would be pretty much explaining what are the pros and the cons of the methods that you have selected. And in addition to this, you can tie this up to the contextual work that has been done before, to the literature that has been generated before. You may as well mention authors and scholars who have used the same methods before you. And in a way, this would be a very solid foundation for justifying the relevance of the methods you've selected. Very often, I would like to think about the methodology section almost like a literature review of the particular methods that you have selected. The methodology section is the section from where you may borrow the most of other people's works, and of course referencing it properly. And this is the case because the methodology explains all kinds of philosophical stances and perspective because they are also important to research. We would have a separate conversation about methods later on, but for now, this is about the methodology section. This is a fairly straightforward to go through. I never read the whole methodology section unless I'm sure there is 100% fit between the sort of methods that I would like to utilize and the methods that the paper has utilized. So a good idea here is to save as much time as possible from reading the methodology. You may as well skip it very quickly by just having a glance at the sort of data that has been used and the analytical framework. It shouldn't take more than 15 seconds. Again, looking down here in my laptop and scrolling down, we find the next section, which is findings. The findings section could be titled findings, could be titled the results section. It's all the same. There are different variations of how you can label it, but it's all the same. This is a section where the scholars present the empirical work that has been done. And this section should not actually draw much of your attention. If you want to skim through it, that's fine, but it shouldn't take more than 20 seconds to do so. And it may as well take 5 seconds sometimes, because most of the scholars produce some sort of a visual, which is a chart of some sort that explains what type of data was found and how that was structured in a way to make a solid point or argument. So have a look at that visual and you'd very quickly know what the results were. There is no point reading through the whole empirical work, or if it's a qualitative paper, then the results section is particularly long. There's no point at reading the specifics of the section. I've done a fair bit of scrolling down because this paper's empirical work was a lot. And most of the time went through scrolling down. Finally, I reached the discussion chapter. The discussion chapter is among the most important ones. Of course, assuming that you've followed through and you decided to continue reading that paper. The discussion chapter is important because it allows you to understand how the empirical work of this particular paper joins the discussion which was produced in the literature review, or how that work, that piece of work, is to become a significant part of the literature or the broader discussion on that topic. So typically, you would expect some repetition in the discussion chapter. There would be again some introduction of the major strands of literature, something that has been mentioned previously in the literature review section. And then around the middle or the second half of the discussion chapter, you would find out again some discussion about the empirical work, some examples of some major findings or something interesting that has been found. In a way, this is a very, very interesting piece to pay attention to, but again, only if the previous criteria have been sufficed for. And the discussion chapter is a little bit tricky because different papers make different use of the discussion chapter. Some of them introduce the key findings or the significance of the findings within the discussion chapter. Others introduce that in the conclusion chapter. So you need to pay attention to where the research paper introduces these key contributions in. Is it the end of the discussion chapter or is it in the conclusion chapter? Because these are the ones that you want to pay close attention to. Okay, when we speak about contribution, you should know that there are two types of contribution. The first one is contribution to practice, which basically means whatever we find out, we can share with some manager or a company or any sort of practitioner, and they can apply that in their everyday work. They would find the value of it. This would change how they're doing their job. So this is practical contribution. And the second one is theoretical contribution, the sort of theory that has been adopted for this paper, and not only the one we adopted, but how we extended it, how we actually made it richer. Is it just because we have applied this theoretical framework to a new context, or did we find out that there is a new relationship that nobody else was speaking about? So this is what you want to pay significant attention to. So I would like to say that both types of contribution are very important. So you should aim to have that in your own work. And it makes sense to read how other people package their contribution in their own work. Again, this could be in the end of the discussion section or chapter, or it could be within the conclusion chapter. Scrolling down, we find that there is a separate conclusion chapter. There it's almost always some sort of repetition between the type of literature and the contribution. So if the contribution has already been mentioned in the literature review, you can quickly skip through it. Another very important part within the conclusion is the limitations for the particular paper. And this is where you would like to pay the most attention. Do you know why? Because it can help you out. especially if you're not sure what your hypothesis is or what your research question is. Because in the limitation section, the authors suggest what they have missed out, what other types of research could be done to enrich the field. And in this section, they specifically mention what research questions you can borrow. You can take those ideas and develop them in your own work. So they're telling you what's a viable research question, what's an important research question. So this is perhaps the best way to get an idea and start joining this conversation. As you can imagine, after the conclusion chapter comes the referencing or the bibliography. And this is something that most people don't pay attention to. And for the most part, I don't pay attention to it as well. But if all the criteria are evident and match our basically interests, the title fits, the abstract fits, the introduction, the context fits, everything else, then we may have found a paper that is very close to our heart or research interests. And if this is one of those unicorn papers, which will help us to lift our research ideas and produce our own research work, then we should pay attention to the references. Only then. Okay, don't look at the referencing for any other paper that doesn't suffice for all these criteria which we've listed. But looking at the referencing, we need to find some key papers to borrow for our own literature review. So you can look at the titles and then you can utilize those as part of your search strategy for finding more articles. Typically, it takes one unicorn article or article that fits everything that you have dreamed for to find many others within this category. And the easiest way is to look at the referencing. Do you think we missed anything so far? Yes, actually there is one thing we didn't comment on, which is the appendix section of any sort of work, any sort of research work or article. The appendices, typically most people don't pay attention to them at all. For the most part, I actually do, because this is where the scholars or the authors may as well show off their creativity in terms of data presentation, in terms of showing you some fancy charts, designs of some tables, etc. And I would just borrow those designs. I get inspired by people's design skills because mine are not so good. So I get inspired by the sort of data presentation skills they have. And I use that as ideas for presenting additional materials in my own appendix section in the papers I'm writing. So you may as well pay attention to this. But again, this is the sort of added bonus. It shows you some added value. You wouldn't just read it word by word. You just pay attention to the visuals and how they're presented. We covered a lot. Hopefully very useful, and hopefully you get to know what my methodology is when it comes to reading papers. I almost never finish reading a paper from end to end. Almost never, unless it's that one best paper that I treat as a golden nugget that I just found. Okay, then I may pay more attention to it and I may as well read it several times. But I know that the majority of the papers I find are not to be used. As a matter of fact, even if I do Google Key Search or Google Scholar or use the university's library, then I know 90% of the papers I find I should not even read. They don't go through the reading abstract checkpoint. I just scrap them altogether. I delete them immediately. And I know that I'm not reading many literature reviews either. Perhaps only 5% of the papers I found would have something within the literature review that is relevant to what I want to achieve. And I end up reading, if I read any whole paper at all, it's going to be one or two. And as a matter of fact, this sort of methodology allows me to complete a literature review process within 2 days. And I know it takes a little bit of practice, but most of the time, most of the efforts you put are in vain because it's time wasting, because you end up reading papers for days and days before actually starting to write anything. So I hope this video would help you to prevent any sort of time wasting when it comes to reading papers. And if you enjoyed it, then click the like button or comment down in the section below to let me know which part you particularly struggle with or you particularly enjoy. If you have any hints or suggestions for your mates, for your fellow academics, students, researchers, etc., share that in the comment section. I'm sure they're gonna appreciate it. Thank you very much, and peace out.